Hello everyone, this is Toby from Toby's Urban Sketch, and today we are doing this bit of direct watercolour sketching. What's that mean? It means we use nothing but our brushes and our paints, and with that we can create a fun, lively image like this. We don't need to stress with our pencil, we can just get straight in, loose, messy paints, have some fun. And so that's what we're going to do. Let me know what you think of this in the comments. Is this kind of sketching you enjoy doing, loose and lively? And of course, if you do enjoy, please do like and subscribe. It's a huge support to my little channel. So let's get sketching. And what we're going to do is a bit of direct watercolour sketching. So we're going to be starting with our brush, with a big brush nonetheless, and just going for it and finding those shapes with our brush. You can see this has got a fabulous bit of perspective, this scene, so we're just going to be playing with that, but all the while just using our watercolours. So we don't need to worry too much with direct watercolour sketching because we're used to just sketching anyway, aren't we? We're used to it. We just need to take away the idea that this is in some way crazy, different, impossible, and just use our brush to pick out those shapes. So this is just like we've done a line drawing, isn't it? All that we do is we then just use our line drawing and we sort of block in those shapes straight away. What I'm going to do, I'm going to catch this shape, which is the roof line, and I'm going to move along and then catch the next one. Each time we're just varying our wash a little bit, so the variation in watercolours is where the magic really comes from. And we don't need to overdo it either. This is sort of just a really simple light sketch. We've got lots of white in those walls, so we could even be prepared to leave those walls completely white. I'm not saying we will, but we just don't need to overdo it or worry or over challenge ourselves. Always good to stretch ourselves a bit, but not to perceive it necessarily as a challenge, but more as just an exploration and a bit of fun. You can see the bottom of the reference, it just sort of disappears, doesn't it? So just give it that feel by coming in and loosely washing into it. This is a dry piece of paper as well, so often it's nice to do a bit of wet on wet painting or a bit of dry painting or whatever, but this time we're just doing a normal wet on dry, so wet watercolours on dry paper. But because we're painting nice and wet, you can see our colours are nice and fluid for a long time. So another way of getting in some variation is to come back in and drop in those colours and move some water around. And we can just pick out a few extra shapes as well. But again, don't overdo it yet. This is just picking out shapes. The key about painting nice and wet is that it keeps you flexible, it keeps you able to sort of move things around. You don't have to get it right the first time, just like when we sketch with pens and we use nice wobbly, loose, gentle lines. We don't need to get things right if we start loose, if we don't just assume that whatever we do first has to be perfect. By applying different amounts of water, you can get different effects as well, so we can watch our colours go up or come down. And not everything has to be done first with this big brush either, so we can just get some of these biggest shapes. Like these windows can stay till a bit later. The advantage of a nice big flat brush like this is that you can get long straight lines without too much fuss. Same with these edges of the church here, we just can get them without too much of a challenge, just because we're using a brush which is already a long and straight shape. We can pull some of these areas across, just again, all we're doing, creating a bit of variation. Then when we get to the top, again, easy to do because we've got this long straight brush. So it might feel like it's clunky and clumsy and you can't draw what you want. Or on the other hand, it might just feel like it's an absolute shortcut, absolute no-brainer, because it lets you just immediately grab those lines and those shapes, which might otherwise be quite a challenge. Now when we get to the sky, I want to start adding in a bit of tone behind, so I'm going to take some cobalt, it's a bit of cobalt blue here, and then a bit of moon glow, because this sky is definitely on the moody side, isn't it? We just keep things wet, so it's on a dry piece of paper, but we can move it around. And you see how dark this spire is in the image? Well, that means that we can paint over whatever we add to the sky. So that's why I'm not worrying too much, well, at all, about keeping the sky here clear, because I know that we're going to be able to paint over it. We don't have to worry either about leaving white around the tower or elsewhere, because it's easy to just keep it as a nice fluid feel if we do that. Brushing in some sky or brushing out like this gives that fluid feel as well. It gives this idea that there's some light sort of breaking through and washing over your image. And you'll see that often I say you paint like wet on wet's a really nice way of keeping things fluid, but you can see actually if we use enough water we can paint really fluid, we can sketch really fluidly, even if we're starting off with a dry piece of paper. What I'm not going to do is then jump in with my tower here, because if I do that everything's going to flow everywhere, because we are so damp and we've left things so fluid. So what we'll do is we'll move on to the next stage. These are our light big shapes, but next we move on to a sort of one size brush down. We've gone from a flat brush to a mop brush, and this is quite a small mop brush, a size 2 mop brush. And with that we're going to pull out a few more of these shadows and shapes. We don't have to stick with the totally realistic colours, just take a little bit of guidance from them. And so I'm going to use a lot of quinacridone here. I'm going to use quinacridone as kind of the base, and then around that quinacridone I'm going to play with different colours. So for example, adding in some Perylene Violet to create a different sort of depth of shadow. And then there's another lovely window here, and we'll use a similar mix of colours. At the bottom we can start just bringing in these what they call the sort of I always lose my words when I start talking about railings here. Tops of the railings we can just bring in with that same colour, but then we can also just bring in variation, adding in a bit of indigo here, and then maybe even just get some nice moon glow, which also has a lovely purple feel, a bit like the Perylene, but has a very different granularity to it. We could bring that down and just to the side perhaps of our shapes here, of our it's gone again, of our railings. We can use it to outline some of the ideas of shapes we've got going on there. And again, remember, nice and loose. This is a loose sketch, so keep things fluid. If you want to move things, if you want to soften things, don't be afraid to do that. And you just do that with a nice clean brush and bring it down. I'm going to re-emphasize this sort of contrast so we can find the edge of our church, and we can make it stand out by making the outside dark, so negatively painting this lovely church. Again, we can bring that down and it can come to the sides of our railings. Very proud of myself for getting that word first time then. Again, keeping things nice and fluid there, letting things move around. We'll then move up and let's get these windows in. We're still very wet, so that's fine. What I'm going to do, that's a bit more movement than I was looking for, but if we just take things gently, we can move that pigment the way we want it. We can just be a bit more prepared with our next couple of windows that it's not yet as dry as we need it to be to create what we want. So instead we can use some of these mixes to create some of these patterns going on in the roof. Just not overdoing it, but just getting some of those shapes. You see how it's got a sort of crissy-crossy pattern in it? We can just get that idea with some wet on wet painting. Going up, we can start introducing again the edges of this building and some of these lines coming across, which are also rather important for the perspective So we've got this kind of 1 point perspective going upwards. And you can just start getting that idea loosely in. Again, we can find a bit of warmth in there with some quinacridone. I would say there is some warmth in there. It is a sort of yellowy, well, maybe an ivory colour, but we're just exaggerating that warmth with a bit of this quinacridone. A few splashes, I think, are another way of making things nice and loose and adding some texture and letting things just move themselves a bit. So now we can touch test up here. You can see there's a tiny bit of water going on, but I think we're probably safe to be going ahead and trying to get at least the start of our tower in. So I'm going to use a smaller brush still, a size 6 round brush, and I'm going to be using some of these nice mixes we've already got. If we mix our indigo with our quinacridone sienna, we end up with a fairly neutral colour, and it can be warmer, it can be browner, it can be bluer, colder, depending on how much of each we get in. And again, the name of the game is soft and loose, so we just allow things to flow. And that means that when we want to finalise things in a bit, well, we haven't overdone it to start with. So we're able to change things still. I think that's enough now. That's that simple level of shape. And just have a little check around. Is there anything else we want to add in before we move on? I think we can just emphasise a couple of our boundaries a little more. And one other thing that we can do nicely now is just bring in this other building. I'm not sure why I'm doing it in such a small brush, so let's use our big brush again. And that can just come all the way up the side. And that's sort of how it sits in the reference, isn't it? And then on top of that, we can come in with a nice bit of mix of Moonglow Perlin, a couple of colours we've already used, and we can just find these edges. I don't think they need to be very well defined. They're just suggestions that there's something else going on just off the side. And now we need to just let things dry, and we can come in with our sort of darkest colours, our smallest brush, and then fix up a bit of the colouring we've done. So here we are, we're pretty much dry, not totally, but pretty much. And what we're going to do is come in with our darkest colours now. So we're using sort of a bit of indigo mixed with different things just to vary it a bit. And we're going to be using our brush a bit like a pen. And you could, if you wanted at this stage, you could use a pen or a brush pen. And that's what I often do is sort of take that shortcut. But today we're going to use this brush, size 6 round, as before. And we're picking out suggestions of detail. So we're not drawing everything, we're not painting everything, but we are suggesting all these lovely details, or some of these lovely details I should say, not all of them. We're also going to get in our darkest shadows, so areas like under these eaves here. We're going to leave plenty of white. All these white spaces are just little gaps where the painting could breathe, so we don't need to cover them, we just need to do enough to provide some structure to what's already quite an interesting set of lovely shapes. Now you can see, if you count, there should be more sections to this tower, but as with any sketching, and particularly if you're doing some direct watercolour sketching like this, it's hard to count, it's hard to get things exactly right, and it's not what we're here for, not what we're aiming for, so don't worry about it. I'm certainly not worried that I've counted slightly wrong here. What I'm going to do is just lose one of the empty ones, so we can still get our lovely clocks in, for example. What I'm going to do with those, half a circle of dark, I think. And then instead of just painting in all the individual numbers, I'm just going to drop in a bit of quinacridone to get that sense that there's something else. There's a bit of light and interest going on there, and just create these sort of loose circles again, just to show it's a bit different. This is something a bit different. We can do the same actually down some of these areas. You see these lovely golden bricks? Well, let's just suggest some of those with touches of gold coming in at the edges. Now we just continue to work down, doing very similar things. So we suggest the tops of roofs and the edges, just like you would do nice loose sketchy lines in urban sketching with a pen. It's the same in watercolours, just these lovely loose lines. As long as we're painting with enough paint, these things will stay rather firm for us. And just varying again different amounts of colour. And try not to make too much up, so I can't really see much of this because it's hidden behind that tree, isn't it? So I'm not going to make up too much of it, but I can make up a bit, make up at least a little bit of it. I'm going to use this same gold as well here, keeping it the same idea as we've used up the top, just to suggest there's something unifying these different parts. Same here, this same sort of just touches of little bits of gold before coming back with our indigo to bring out individual windows and these darkest lines and shadows. You can even do the same here. So if we take our little railings, we can just add a dark line over them, next to them. Maybe even just have a line coming across. It kind of connects things, shows what's going on. And we're getting there, very, very almost done, aren't we? So just want some of these dark shadows as well. And don't be afraid to add in some bold sort of dry brush marks which really emphasise those shadows. And the same going outwards, because that way we can make a really crisp, clear, negatively painted outline to our church. And a couple more touches of building to go. So we got this, we can just find these like loose shapes and just suggest the shape a little bit more, just a tiny bit, nothing too much, nothing to detract too much from our church. A few splashes into our church perhaps, and maybe a little bit of extra shadow into our spire in a couple of places. Okay, and what's the thing that we've obviously not done yet? Well, it's this lovely golden leaved couple of trees. Now I'm going to leave the tree in the middle here because I want my lovely church to shine through, but the tree to the side, well, let's take some quinacridone, again quinacridone sienna, bit of indigo, and come up the side here. And I'm working top down because that way I can set the size of the tree with the thinnest brush strokes, and then as I come down I can be more bold and introduce some bigger, deeper lines just by pressing a little bit harder. And then we need to start having a think about how we're getting these lovely tree, bushy leaves in. So first I'm going to soften some of these branches, so just wetting my brush, cleaning my brush, drying it off, and then do you look how almost a bit of brush abuse. Do you see how that little bit of brush abuse, and sorry for abusing my brushes, but do you see how it creates this lovely shape? We just need to make sure we've got just enough water on the brush, and then it just softens, it moves things, it makes things so lively and fun. And already I would say that's actually almost the effect I was after from the finish, and that's what I love about watercolours, is they can just surprise you, they can produce lovely things which you weren't expecting to happen so quickly, but it's not fully what I'm after. So what I'm actually going to do as well is come in with some quinacridone gold. And where things are still nice and wet, we can dance this brush around, and where it's wet meets dry, you get different effects. You've got these little lines, and then you've got these blooms of colour. And this same colour is reflected all in our building, so it's now perhaps becoming clear why I was using these same gold tones as bricks, and why I'm using these warm tones as bricks, because now our whole image has got a lovely joined up feel. It's not just separate on the page. As we come close, do you see how some of these leaves are really well defined right in our vision? So we can start using thicker painted lines to really grab some of these leaves. And we can come in with some darks as well and perhaps join up some of these leaves, especially at the bottom, but even a little bit at the top. We can just reintroduce a little bit of those structural lines. And even, dare I do it again, some more splashes, both with that dark but also with our lovely quinacridone. And there you go. You could keep going, you could take your time, you could do more, less. It's very tempting, especially with lovely watercolours like this, just to keep touching, but the risk is always overdoing it. Someone asked me recently, how do I practice these sketches and how do I get the composition right and things like that? Well, no, I don't practice these sketches. And my biggest tip for how to get things right, not overdo things, is when you think you might be done, just stop, step away and give yourself some time. I can always come back to this later, in an hour, tomorrow, in a week, and I can add more. But if I go too far, then the last sort of 20 minutes of fun we've been having could get, not necessarily ruined, but it could become less and less despite me putting in more and more effort. So I'm going to stop there, enjoy what I've got, and if I want to add more another time, I will. And with that, we are done. So I hope you've enjoyed this, a nice bit of direct watercolour sketching, no pencil, no pen, nothing, just watercolours straight on a page. A lovely way of playing with your watercolours and just immediately getting out there and painting. If you enjoyed, please do like, subscribe and leave a comment. And thank you very much for watching.